The morning promised nothing more than another long stretch of asphalt and silence. The light had not yet conquered the sky, and the truck driver, as usual, had already begun his route along UES, Route 60, cutting through the interior of New Mexico. The dry breeze invaded through the window crack, and the engine purred low, as if still awakening. The familiar smell of diesel and dry earth permeated everything, while the first rays of sun tried to overcome the shadow of the distant hills. Jake Martinez had been driving this route for 15 years. Every curve, every mile marker, every weathered billboard was etched into his memory like a well-worn map. At 42, he had found a certain peace in the predictability of the road. No surprises, no complications, just him, his 18-wheeler, and the endless ribbon of highway that stretched toward the horizon. His ex-wife Sarah used to complain about his long absences, but Jake had never been able to explain how the solitude of the road felt more like home than any house ever had. This particular morning felt different, though he couldn't quite place why. Maybe it was the way the sunrise painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, or perhaps it was the dream he'd had the night before. Fragments of his childhood home in Albuquerque, his mother's voice calling him for dinner, the sound of his father's tools in the garage. Dreams had a way of following him onto the road, lingering like smoke in the cab of his truck. About an hour after leaving the last gas station, he spotted two figures in the distance. At first, he thought they were shadows cast by the dry vegetation, but something made him squint his eyes. He reduced speed by instinct, the same instinct he had learned to listen to after years on the road. As he approached, he saw more clearly two elderly people walking side by side, barefoot, hand in hand, with slow, shuffling steps. The man was helping the woman stay on her feet, and she, fragile, leaned on him like someone holding onto the last point of balance with the world. Her silver hair caught the morning light, and even from a distance, Jake could see the determined set of her shoulders despite her obvious struggle. The man beside her moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent years learning to be another person's strength. Jake hesitated about stopping. He remembered stories colleagues told about staged ambushes, scams on deserted roads, people pretending to need help. The trucking community was full of such warnings, passed down like folklore around truck stop coffee machines. But there was something about this scene that broke through any skepticism. Maybe it was the way the man held her, or how she squinted against the wind without giving up moving forward. Maybe it was the absolute vulnerability of two people walking barefoot on scorching asphalt with nothing but each other. He stopped the truck slowly, without haste, as if he were framing that moment so as not to break it. The air brakes hissed as he pulled over, and he rolled down the window. The desert air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. "Are you folks okay?" he called out, his voice rough from hours of silence. The man looked up with eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the world's hardships. His voice was hoarse when he responded that they needed to get to truth or consequences. The woman was sick and needed medical help. They had no car, no phone, no one nearby to help. The simplicity of their desperation struck Jake like a physical blow. He climbed down from the cab, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. Up close, he could see the woman's condition was worse than he'd initially thought. Her feet were swollen, dirty, with deep cracks that spoke of miles walked on unforgiving ground. She carried a small purse clutched against her chest, and when he helped her up into the cab, she dropped something wrapped in cloth. It was an old photograph, faded and worn at the edges, showing a young man in military uniform. The black and white image had the quality of something treasured, handled countless times by loving fingers. Jake didn't comment, just discreetly returned the picture to her weathered hands. She looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo from somewhere beyond the present moment. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Walter, settled slowly into the seat, breathing heavily. The woman, Mrs. Grace, leaned back with effort, holding an empty plastic bottle with both hands as if it were a precious object. Her fingers were thin and translucent, marked by age spots and the evidence of a life lived working with her hands. Jake started the engine again, and for several minutes, no one said a word. Only the sound of asphalt sliding under the tires filled the silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes when strangers recognize something essential in each other. A shared understanding that words might only diminish. The radio began to interfere, a strange static, until an old song began to play. Jake recognized the melody immediately. It was one of those songs his mother used to hum when he was small, something by Patsy Cline that would drift through their small kitchen on Sunday mornings. He didn't understand why that memory crossed his mind just now, but it hit him with unexpected force. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Mrs. Grace with her eyes closed, whispering something that seemed to follow the rhythm of the music. Her lips moved silently, and for a moment, Jake felt as though he were witnessing something sacred, a private communion between this stranger and some distant memory of her own. The road continued straight and deserted, as always, but something inside the cab had changed. During a brief stop to check the tires, Jake found a small bracelet on the floor of the cab with the name Thomas engraved on it. It was a child's bracelet, worn and probably fallen from Mrs. Grace's purse. The metal was tarnished, but the name was still clearly visible, etched with the careful precision of a loving gift. Once again, he said nothing, but the name echoed inside him with unexpected force. Thomas. Who was Thomas? A son, a grandson, and why did that simple name, engraved on a child's bracelet, feel like a key to something he didn't yet understand? If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. As they approached truth or consequences, Jake noticed Mrs. Grace becoming more restless. She kept touching the photograph in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges with the careful devotion of someone handling a holy relic. The military uniform in the picture seemed to shimmer in the changing light, and Jake found himself wondering about the young man's story. Was he Mrs. Grace's son, her husband in his youth? The mystery gnawed at him in a way that surprised him. Walter had been mostly silent during the drive, but now he began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "She hasn't been the same since the letters stopped coming," he said, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Every day for 30 years, she'd walk to the mailbox, rain or shine, that woman would make that walk. Then one day, nothing, and nothing ever since." Jake's curiosity was piqued, but he sensed that pressing for details would be like trying to catch smoke. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, watching the small town of truth or consequences emerge from the desert like a mirage made real. The irony of the town's name wasn't lost on him. Sometimes the truth did demand consequences, and sometimes those consequences were harder to bear than the lies that preceded them. The clinic was a simple construction with light-colored walls, standing like a beacon of hope in the harsh desert landscape. As they pulled up, Jake noticed a woman in scrubs stepping out to meet them, her face immediately registering concern at the sight of Mrs. Grace's condition. The efficiency with which she and her colleague helped the elderly woman inside spoke of a staff accustomed to emergency situations in this remote location. While the medical team attended to Mrs. Grace, Jake and Walter waited outside on a wooden bench that creaked with every movement. The air seemed drier here, if that was possible, and the silence between them felt loaded with unspoken questions. Walter's eyes were fixed on the clinic doors, but Jake sensed his mind was somewhere else entirely. "We left the ranch before dawn," Walter finally said, his voice low and strained. Grace could barely breathe during the night. "It's not the first time." He paused, seemingly gathering the strength to continue. "We've tried to get help before, but the world keeps getting further away from where we live. No phone anymore, electricity comes and goes, and the neighbors who used to help, they left years ago." Jake found himself studying Walter's profile, the deep lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried what looked like decades of worry. This wasn't just about Mrs. Grace's health. There was something deeper, something that went beyond medical emergencies and rural isolation. "The Thomas on the bracelet," Jake said carefully. "Is he family?" Walter's reaction was immediate and profound. His entire body seemed to tense, and for a moment, Jake thought he might not answer at all. When he did speak, his voice was barely audible. "Thomas Jr. is Grace's grandson. Haven't seen him in 15 years, not since..." He stopped abruptly, as if the words were too painful to continue. Before Jake could respond, an elderly woman walking past the clinic stopped, looked at them both, and asked, "Is she still alive?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. The woman explained that years ago, Mrs. Grace had been treated there for another heart problem, but they never returned when they should have, always arrived too late. Something in that phrase weighed like a stone. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of time and limitations. The woman continued, "I remember because she always asked about mail service to the ranch, said she was expecting an important letter that never came. Broke my heart. It did." She shook her head sadly before continuing on her way, leaving Jake and Walter alone with the weight of her words. As they returned to the waiting room, Jake noticed Mrs. Grace's purse had fallen open on the floor. While looking for a tissue, he found, folded and already yellowed, an incomplete letter. It was addressed to Thomas Jr. The words spoke of longing, of regret, of an attempt at reconciliation that had never been sent. Jake felt like an intruder reading those private thoughts. But he couldn't stop himself from absorbing every word. The letter spoke of birthdays missed, of words said in anger that couldn't be taken back, of a grandmother's love that had never diminished despite years of silence. It mentioned a fight, harsh words exchanged, and a young man who had walked away promising never to return. But most heartbreaking of all were the lines about dreams where Mrs. Grace imagined Thomas Jr. reading her letters, forgiving her, coming home. Jake felt something shift inside him as he carefully folded the letter and placed it back where he'd found it. This wasn't just about two elderly people needing medical help. This was about broken families, about pride and stubbornness, about the terrible cost of silence. And somehow, inexplicably, he felt connected to their story in a way that defied explanation. When they were finally allowed to see Mrs. Grace, she was stabilized with an IV in her arm and a slight smile on her face. She recognized Jake immediately and murmured something he would never forget. "The light is different today." Walter observed her in silence, sitting beside her, her hands held between his own. The tenderness between them was palpable, a love that had weathered decades of hardship and loss. The nurse explained that they would need rest, proper nutrition, and a new medication. The one they had been using before, bought without a prescription, had been doing more harm than good. She also mentioned that Mrs. Grace had been asking about mail service to their ranch, wondering if there was a way to ensure important letters wouldn't get lost. As evening approached, Jake stepped outside to get some food. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and for a moment, he felt the strange sensation that this day had been leading to something significant, something that would change the course of all their lives. He just didn't know what yet. When Jake returned with hot coffee and fresh bread, he found Walter with a distant look in his eyes, staring at something only he could see. The hospital corridor was quiet, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional footstep of a nurse making rounds. Walter's weathered hands were wrapped around a cup of water, but he hadn't touched it in the hour Jake had been gone. "She's sleeping," Walter said, without looking up. First peaceful sleep she's had in weeks. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying another person's pain for far too long. Doctor says her heart is stronger than we thought. But the stress is what's killing her. Jake settled into the plastic chair beside him, the coffee warming his hands as the desert evening brought its characteristic chill. The letter I saw, he said carefully, the one to Thomas Jr. Why hasn't she sent it? Walter's laugh was bitter and hollow. Pride, stubbornness, fear. Take your pick. He finally looked at Jake, his eyes reflecting decades of regret. You see, Thomas Jr. didn't just leave angry. He left because of me. The confession hung in the air between them, like a confession made in a church confessional. Walter seemed to shrink into himself, becoming smaller with each word. Grace's daughter, Thomas's mother, she passed away when he was 12. Car accident on a night when the roads were slick with rain. Grace and I, we took him in, raised him like our own son. Jake remained silent, sensing that interrupting would be like damming a river in full flood. That boy was everything to Grace, Walter continued, his voice growing stronger with the telling. Smart as a whip, full of dreams about college, about seeing the world. But I was from the old school. Believed in hard work, in staying close to family, in not reaching above your station. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. When Thomas got that scholarship to the university in California, I told him it was a waste of time. Said he'd be better off working the ranch, learning a trade, staying where he belonged. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, and Jake felt his heart sink as he anticipated where this story was heading. The fight happened the night before he was supposed to leave, Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. I told him he was being selfish, abandoning the people who raised him, said that if he left, he shouldn't bother coming back. Grace tried to stop me, tried to make me see reason, but I was too proud, too stubborn, too afraid of losing him to listen. Jake closed his eyes, imagining the scene, a young man torn between loyalty and dreams, an elderly woman caught between her husband and her grandson, and pride making decisions that would haunt them all for years to come. He left that night, Walter continued, packed his things and walked out without saying goodbye. Grace cried for days, then weeks. She wrote letter after letter, but I never let her send them, told her he'd made his choice, that we should respect it, but really, I was afraid that if he responded, it would prove I was wrong, afraid that if he didn't respond, it would prove I was right, and that would be even worse. The confession was devastating in its honesty. Jake found himself thinking of his own relationship with his father, the arguments they'd had, the stubborn silences that had lasted months at a time. How easy it was to let pride build walls that became too high to climb over. After a few years, Walter went on, Grace stopped asking about sending the letters, but she never stopped writing them, found them all in a box under our bed, hundreds of them, all addressed to Thomas Jr., all filled with news about the ranch, about the town, about how much she missed him. All unsent, Jake felt a strange tightness in his chest. And you never tried to find him, never tried to make contact. Walter's smile was sad and self-deprecating. Oh, we tried. About 5 years ago, when Grace's health started failing, we hired a private investigator. Cost us most of our savings, but we had to know. He paused, gathering strength for what came next. Thomas Jr. lives in Los Angeles now. He's a successful architect, married, has 2 children. The investigator showed us pictures. He looks just like his mother did at that age. But you never reached out to him. We tried. The investigator gave us his address, his phone number, even his email. But every time Grace would start to dial, she'd remember that last fight, remember him walking away, and she'd lose her nerve. And I I couldn't bring myself to admit that 15 years of silence was my fault. The weight of Walter's admission settled over them like a shroud. Jake found himself thinking about second chances, about the courage it took to admit mistakes, about the terrible cost of letting pride override love. He thought about his own ex-wife, about the things they'd never said to each other, about the opportunities for reconciliation that had slipped away like sand through fingers. "And there's something else," Walter said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The investigator told us that Thomas Jr. has been sending letters to us for years. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, updates about his life, his children. But our mail service, it's so unreliable out at the ranch, we never got any of them." The irony was heartbreaking. While Grace had been writing letters she never sent, Thomas Jr. had been sending letters they never received. Years of love and longing, lost in the inefficiency of rural mail service and the cruel coincidence of timing. Jake felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Looking at Walter's defeated posture, at the pain etched in every line of his face, he made a decision that would change everything. "Walter," he said, his voice firm with newfound determination, "what if I told you there might be a way to fix this?" Walter looked up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since Jake had met him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Jake said, standing up and pacing to the window where the desert stars were beginning to appear, "that sometimes the universe puts people in your path for a reason, and sometimes the only way to heal old wounds is to stop being afraid of the consequences and start focusing on the truth." He turned back to Walter, his mind already forming a plan. "I drive through Los Angeles on my route twice a month. What if Thomas Jr. knew that his letters were never reaching you? What if he knew that his grandmother has been writing to him for 15 years, waiting for him to forgive her for something that was never her fault?" Walter's eyes widened with possibility and fear in equal measure. "You'd do that? You'd really do that for strangers?" Jake smiled, feeling more certain than he'd felt about anything in years. "Walter, I don't think we're strangers anymore. And I think it's time for your family to stop living with the weight of words that were never spoken." 3 days later, Jake found himself parked outside a modern architectural firm in downtown Los Angeles, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt since his wedding day. The building was all glass and steel, reaching toward the sky with the kind of ambition that Walter had feared would take Thomas Jr. away from them forever. In his jacket pocket, he carried Mrs. Grace's most recent letter, the one she had finally finished writing with trembling hands after he had convinced her to trust him with this mission. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes and a professional smile, looked surprised when Jake asked to see Thomas Matthews. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "No, ma'am," Jake replied, his rough hands nervously adjusting his baseball cap. "But I have something that belongs to him, something from his grandmother." The word grandmother seemed to electrify the air. The receptionist's expression shifted from polite professionalism to genuine curiosity. "One moment, please," she said, picking up the phone and speaking in hushed tones. Within minutes, a man appeared at the reception desk, and Jake felt his breath catch. Thomas Matthews Jr. was indeed the image of his mother from the photograph, tall, with the same gentle eyes that Jake had seen in Mrs. Grace, but carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had built a successful life from nothing. He was wearing an expensive suit, but there was something in his posture, in the way he held his shoulders, that reminded Jake of Walter. "I'm Thomas Matthews," he said, extending his hand. "Jennifer said you have something from my grandmother." Jake shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the slight tremor in Thomas's voice when he mentioned his grandmother. "Mr. Matthews, my name is Jake Martinez. I'm a truck driver, and 3 days ago, I picked up your grandparents on Route 60. Your grandmother asked me to deliver this to you." Thomas's face went pale, and for a moment, Jake thought he might faint. My grandparents. Are they all right? Your grandmother had some health issues, but she's stable now, Jake said gently. But Mr. Matthews, there's a lot more to this story than just a letter. Would you have a few minutes to talk? Thomas looked around the busy office, then back at Jake. Let me grab my coat. There's a coffee shop across the street. This sounds like a conversation we need to have in private. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a corner booth. 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them while Jake recounted the events of the past few days. Thomas listened with increasing emotion, his hands gripping his coffee cup so tightly that Jake worried it might shatter. They hired a private investigator, Thomas asked, his voice breaking slightly. They've been trying to reach me. For years, Jake confirmed. And Thomas, there's something else. Your grandfather told me that you've been sending letters, cards, updates about your life. They never got them. The mail service to the ranch is unreliable at best. Thomas put his head in his hands, and Jake could see his shoulders shaking. I've been writing to them every month for 15 years, he whispered. Every birthday, every Christmas, every major milestone in my life. I sent them pictures of my wedding, of my children being born, of my first big architectural project. I thought they didn't want to hear from me. The tragedy of the situation hit Jake like a physical blow. 2 sides of a family, both reaching out, both believing they had been rejected by the other. Pride, stubbornness, and the simple failure of a mail system had conspired to keep them apart. There's more, Jake said gently, pulling out Mrs. Grace's letter. Your grandmother wanted you to have this. She wrote it after I told her I was coming to see you. Thomas took the letter with trembling hands. The envelope was worn and soft, as if it had been handled many times. His name was written in shaky handwriting on the front, and Jake could see the love in every carefully formed letter. She wanted me to tell you, Jake continued, that the fight 15 years ago, the things your grandfather said, that wasn't her. She wanted you to go to college, wanted you to chase your dreams. She's been proud of you every single day since you left. Thomas opened the letter and began to read, and Jake watched as tears started to flow down his face. The letter was everything Jake had hoped it would be, an outpouring of love, of regret, of hope for reconciliation. It spoke of sleepless nights, wondering if he was happy, of a grandmother's love that had never diminished despite the years of silence. She kept every newspaper clipping she could find about my work, Thomas said, looking up from the letter. How did she even know about my projects? Small towns have their ways, Jake said with a smile. Your grandfather mentioned that she'd drive into town sometimes just to use the library computer to look up your name. She's been following your career from the beginning. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking suddenly younger, more vulnerable. And I have children now, twin boys, 7 years old. They ask about their great-grandparents sometimes, and I never knew what to tell them. I thought my grandparents wanted nothing to do with us. Jake felt a surge of hope. What if they could meet them? What if this whole misunderstanding could finally be set right? Thomas looked at him with an expression of desperate hope. You really think they'd want to see me? After all these years? Jake laughed, remembering the way Mrs. Grace had clutched that photograph of Thomas in his military uniform, the way she had whispered his name in her sleep. Thomas, I think your grandmother would walk across the desert barefoot to see you again. In fact, that's basically what she was doing when I found them. Thomas stood up abruptly, pacing to the window of the coffee shop. I need to call my wife. I need to arrange time off work. How far is their ranch from Truth or Consequences? About 40 miles, Jake said. But Thomas, there's something you should know. They're not exactly living in luxury out there. The ranch has seen better days, and they're struggling financially. Your grandfather is proud, too proud to ask for help, but they could use it. Thomas turned back to Jake, his expression determined. I don't care about the ranch. I don't care about the money. I just want my grandmother to know that I never stopped loving her, that I never stopped hoping we'd find our way back to each other. Jake felt something warm and satisfying settle in his chest. This was what he had hoped for, what he had prayed for during the long drive to Los Angeles. Sometimes, he thought, the universe did put people in your path for a reason. There's one more thing, Jake said, pulling out the small bracelet with Thomas's name on it. Your grandmother dropped this in my truck. She's been carrying it with her all these years. Thomas took the bracelet, and Jake watched as recognition dawned on his face. My mother gave this to me for my 6th birthday, he whispered. I lost it somewhere at the ranch when I was 8. Grandma Grace told me she'd find it, and she did. She's been keeping it all this time. The weight of 15 years of love, of hope, of waiting seemed to settle over them both. Jake looked at Thomas, successful, accomplished, but in this moment looking like a lost child who had finally found his way home. Mr. Martinez, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to thank you for this. You've given me back my family. Jake smiled, thinking of Mrs. Grace's peaceful face as she slept in the hospital bed, of Walter's hope-filled eyes when he had promised to make this journey. Just promise me you'll go see them. Promise me you won't let pride or fear keep you apart anymore. Thomas nodded, clutching the letter and the bracelet to his chest. I promise. We'll leave tomorrow. Jake had never been more nervous about a delivery in his 15 years of trucking. As he drove back toward New Mexico with Thomas and his family following behind in their rental car, he kept checking his mirrors to make sure they were still there. Thomas had insisted on flying his wife Rebecca and their twin boys, Michael and David, to Albuquerque, then driving the final stretch together as a family. The symbolism wasn't lost on Jake. This journey needed to be made together, as it should have been 15 years ago. Walter had been skeptical when Jake called from Los Angeles. You found him. He wants to come. His voice had carried such a mixture of hope and disbelief that Jake's heart had ached for the old man. And Jake, what if Grace's heart can't handle the shock? What if seeing him after all these years is too much? Walter, Jake had said gently, what if not seeing him is what's really killing her? Now, as they approached the familiar stretch of Route 60, where this whole journey had begun, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had set something in motion that couldn't be undone, and he prayed with every mile that he had made the right choice. The ranch appeared on the horizon like something from an old Western movie. Weathered buildings, a rusted windmill turning lazily in the desert breeze, and the kind of vast emptiness that could either feel like freedom or isolation, depending on your perspective. Jake pulled up to the main house, his truck's engine disturbing the profound silence that seemed to blanket the property. Walter emerged from the house, moving slowly, his eyes immediately finding the car that had followed Jake's truck. Through the windshield, Jake could see Thomas gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. Rebecca sat beside him, one hand on his shoulder, while the two boys peered out the back windows with the wide-eyed curiosity of children encountering something completely outside their experience. The moment stretched like a held breath. 3 generations of Matthews family, separated by 15 years of misunderstanding and pride, were about to collide in this remote corner of the New Mexico desert. Jake climbed down from his truck, feeling like a director about to call action on the most important scene of his life. Walter, he called out, I brought some people to see you. Walter's face was a mask of controlled emotion as Thomas finally opened the car door and stepped out. The resemblance between grandfather and grandson was striking. The same proud bearing, the same careful way of moving, the same eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. But where Walter's shoulders were bent with age and regret, Thomas stood straight with the confidence of a man who had built something meaningful with his life. They faced each other across 20 feet of dusty ground that might as well have been 20 years of silence. Jake found himself holding his breath, wondering if either man would have the courage to bridge the gap that pride had created. It was Thomas who moved first. He walked slowly toward Walter, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel, his city clothes looking alien in the ranch setting. When he was close enough to touch, he stopped and simply said, "Hello, Grandpa." Walter's composure cracked like an eggshell, his face crumpled, and he reached out with shaking hands to touch Thomas's face, as if he couldn't believe he was real. "Tommy," he whispered, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in 15 years. My boy, you came home." The embrace that followed was fierce and desperate, two men trying to compress 15 years of longing into a single moment. Jake watched with tears in his eyes as Rebecca got out of the car with the twins, hanging back to give the men their moment while keeping a protective eye on her children. "Where's Grandma Grace?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled against Walter's shoulder. "Inside," Walter replied, his voice breaking. She's been waiting for you." The house was cool and dim after the harsh desert sunlight. It was clearly the home of people who had lived there for decades, every surface covered with the accumulated treasures of a long life together. Photographs covered the mantelpiece, and Jake was startled to see several pictures of Thomas through the years that could only have come from newspaper clippings and internet searches. Mrs. Grace had indeed been following her grandson's life from afar. She was sitting in a rocking chair by the window, her silver hair caught in the afternoon light, wearing a blue dress that Jake suspected she had put on specially for this occasion. Her face was turned toward the approaching sound of footsteps, and Jake could see her hands trembling in her lap. "Grace," Walter said softly, "someone's here to see you." Thomas stepped into view, and Mrs. Grace's hand flew to her heart. For a terrifying moment, Jake thought Walter had been right to worry about the shock being too much for her. But then her face transformed with joy, so pure and radiant that it seemed to light up the entire room. "Thomas," she breathed, and the name carried 15 years of love and longing and hope. "My beautiful boy." Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her fragile hands in his strong ones. "Grandma Grace, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I let pride keep us apart." Grace cupped his face in her weathered hands, studying every line as if memorizing him all over again. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's all that matters. You're here now." Rebecca stepped forward then, gently guiding the twins into the room. "Mom Grace," Thomas said, using the name that came as naturally as breathing, "I want you to meet my wife Rebecca and your great-grandchildren, Michael and David." Mrs. Grace's eyes widened as she took in the sight of the two boys, carbon copies of Thomas at that age, staring at her with the frank curiosity of children. "Great-grandchildren," she repeated wonderingly. "Oh, my stars, I'm a great-grandmother." The boys, initially shy, were soon charmed by Mrs. Grace's gentle manner and Walter's gruff but kind attention. Within an hour, they were exploring the ranch, listening to Walter's stories about horses and desert wildlife, while Rebecca and Mrs. Grace sat together on the porch, sharing photographs and stories about Thomas's childhood and his life in Los Angeles. Jake found Thomas standing alone in the barn, looking at an old workbench covered with hand tools. "This is where I learned to build things," Thomas said without turning around. "Grandpa Walter taught me to use every one of these tools, said a man who could build with his hands would never go hungry." "He was right," Jake said, thinking of Thomas's successful architectural firm. "You just used those skills on a bigger scale than he imagined." Thomas picked up a small wooden horse, clearly hand-carved and well-loved. "I made this when I was 10. Grandma Grace said it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen." He smiled, turning the toy over in his hands. "It's pretty rough, actually, but she kept it all these years." "Love does that," Jake observed. "It makes us keep things that remind us of the people who matter." Thomas looked at him with an expression of profound gratitude. "Jake, I don't know how I can ever repay you for this. You've given me back my family, my children, their great-grandparents, my wife, the family stories she's always wanted to hear." Jake shook his head. "Thomas, sometimes the universe puts people in your path not because you need to repay them, but because they need to learn something too. This journey has taught me that it's never too late to fix what's broken, never too late to choose love over pride." As the sun began to set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the extended Matthews family gathered on the porch. Mrs. Grace sat in her rocking chair with 7-year-old David on her lap, telling him stories about his father's childhood adventures. Walter and Michael were examining a collection of interesting rocks, while Thomas and Rebecca sat close together, watching the scene with wonder. Jake prepared to leave, but Walter caught his arm. "You'll stay for dinner," he said firmly. It wasn't a question. "Grace has been cooking all afternoon, says she hasn't had a reason to make a real family meal in 15 years. As they sat around the old dining room table, sharing a feast of Grace's famous green chili stew and homemade tortillas, Jake realized he was witnessing something sacred, the healing of a family, the mending of hearts that had been broken by pride and misunderstanding. But as perfect as the evening was, Jake sensed there was still one more revelation to come, one more truth that needed to be spoken before this family could truly heal. After dinner, while the family continued their reunion on the porch, Jake found himself alone in the kitchen with Mrs. Grace, helping her wash the dishes that had witnessed the first family meal in 15 years. The old woman's hands moved with practiced efficiency despite their trembling, and Jake marveled at her quiet strength. "Do you know," Mrs. Grace said softly, not looking up from the soapy water, "I always knew this day would come, not hoped. Knew. A mother's heart, a grandmother's heart. It knows these things." Jake dried a plate carefully, sensing there was more she wanted to say. Through the window, he could see Thomas pushing his sons on an old tire swing that Walter had rigged up from a sturdy oak tree, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "And there's something I need to tell you, Jake," Mrs. Grace continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told Walter, something I haven't told Thomas, but you've been our angel, our messenger. I think you deserve to know the whole truth." Jake set down the dish towel, giving her his full attention. Mrs. Grace dried her hands slowly, as if gathering courage for what came next. "The night Thomas left, the night of that terrible fight," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the confession, "I did something I've regretted every day since. Walter had forbidden me from going after Thomas, said we needed to let him make his own mistakes. But I couldn't bear the thought of him leaving angry, leaving without knowing how much I loved him." She moved to the kitchen window. Looking out at her great-grandsons playing in the yard she had once watched their father explore with the same boundless energy. "I followed him," she said simply. "I took the old pickup and followed him to the bus station in town. I was going to tell him to go, to follow his dreams, to know that at least one person believed in him completely." Jake felt his heart beginning to race, sensing that this revelation was about to shift everything he thought he understood about the Matthews family tragedy. "But when I got there," Mrs. Grace continued, her voice breaking slightly, "he was already on the phone. I could hear him through the glass doors of the station. He was crying, Jake. This strong, proud young man was crying like a broken-hearted child." She turned back to face Jake, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. He was talking to someone, a friend, maybe a counselor from the university, and he was saying that he didn't know if he was making the right choice, that he loved us so much, loved the ranch, loved the life we'd built together. But he felt trapped between loyalty and dreams, between gratitude and ambition. Jake's throat felt tight as he imagined the scene, a young man torn between worlds, making an impossible choice in a bus station in the middle of the night. "And then," Mrs. Grace said, her voice barely audible now. He said something that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. He said, "I think my grandfather is right. Maybe I am being selfish. Maybe love means staying, even when staying feels like dying inside." The weight of this revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Thomas hadn't left in anger or rebellion. He had left in agony, believing that choosing his dreams meant betraying the people who had raised him. "I should have gone inside," Mrs. Grace continued, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. "I should have told him right then that love means wanting someone to fly, not clipping their wings. But I was a coward. I sat in that pickup truck and watched the bus take my grandson away, and I let him leave, believing that his choice had hurt us." Jake felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. "Mrs. Grace, does Thomas know? Does he know that you heard him that night?" She shook her head, fresh tears falling. "No one knows. I've carried this secret for 15 years, Jake. Every letter I wrote, every night I lay awake wondering if he was happy, if he was successful, if he ever forgave us. I knew the truth. I knew he left not because he didn't love us, but because he loved us too much." The kitchen fell silent, except for the distant sound of laughter from the porch. Jake found himself thinking about the weight of secrets, about how love could become twisted into guilt, about how the very depth of caring could create the deepest wounds. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jake asked gently. Mrs. Grace smiled through her tears, an expression of profound relief crossing her face. "Because tonight, for the first time in 15 years, I see joy in my grandson's eyes when he looks at us. Not guilt, not obligation, not the weight of old wounds, just pure joy. And I realize that if I want this family to truly heal, all the truth needs to come out." Jake nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. "You want me to tell him?" "I want you to help me tell him," she corrected. "I want my grandson to know that his leaving wasn't a betrayal. It was the bravest thing he could have done. And I want him to know that every success he's achieved, every building he's designed, every moment of happiness he's found, we've been proud of him every step of the way." Through the window, they watched as Walter joined Thomas and the boys at the tire swing, 4 generations of Matthews men sharing a moment of pure happiness under the vast New Mexico sky. The sight was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. A family finally together, but still carrying the weight of unspoken truths. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Grace said, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a worn envelope. "This is the real first letter I wrote to Thomas after he left. The one I never sent because I was afraid it would make things worse. But I think it's time he read it." Jake took the envelope, noting how the paper was soft with age, and handling Mrs. Grace's careful handwriting on the front simply said, "To my brave grandson." "Mrs. Grace," Jake said, looking into her eyes that held 15 years of regret and love in equal measure, "are you ready to let go of this secret? Are you ready to trust that love is stronger than guilt?" She straightened her shoulders with a dignity that reminded Jake of royalty. "I'm ready, Jake. I'm ready to set us all free." As they walked back toward the porch where the family was gathered, Jake felt the weight of the envelope in his hand and the responsibility of the moment. The reunion had been beautiful, but he knew that true healing required complete honesty. The Matthews family was about to learn that sometimes the most painful truths were also the most liberating. The sound of laughter grew louder as they approached the porch, and Jake saw Thomas look up with an expression of such contentment that it almost broke his heart. In a few minutes, that expression would change to something much more complex: pain, relief, understanding, and ultimately, Jake hoped, a deeper kind of peace. Mrs. Grace squeezed his arm as they reached the screen door. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered, "for bringing my family home and for helping me find the courage to give them the whole truth." Jake looked out at the family gathered in the golden light of the desert evening, Walter teaching his great-grandsons to whistle, Rebecca and Thomas sharing quiet conversation, the tire swing still moving gently in the breeze. It was a picture of perfect domestic happiness, and he was about to shatter it with a truth that needed to be told. But he had learned something important over the past few days. Sometimes you had to break something before it could be truly whole. As the family gathered on the porch in the soft glow of the evening light, Jake felt the weight of Mrs. Grace's confession settling over him like a mantle of responsibility. The twins had fallen asleep in their father's arms, exhausted from their first day at the ranch, while Rebecca and Walter shared stories about Thomas's childhood adventures. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly right, that Jake almost hesitated to disturb it. But Mrs. Grace caught his eye and nodded slightly, her face set with quiet determination. She had carried this secret for 15 years, and she was ready to set them all free. "Thomas," Mrs. Grace said softly, her voice carrying across the porch like a prayer. "There's something I need to tell you about the night you left." The gentle conversation ceased, and Jake watched as Thomas's expression shifted from contentment to concern. Walter looked between his wife and grandson, sensing the gravity of the moment, but not understanding its source. "Grandma Grace," Thomas said gently, "that's all in the past. We don't need to." "Yes, we do," she interrupted, her voice stronger than Jake had heard it since they'd met. "And we do need to talk about it, because the past 15 years have been built on a misunderstanding, and I won't let another day pass without you knowing the truth." Jake stepped forward, the worn envelope in his hand. "Thomas, your grandmother asked me to help her tell you something she's been carrying alone for far too long." Thomas carefully shifted his sleeping sons, settling them on a porch swing before giving his full attention to his grandmother. Rebecca moved closer to him, her hand finding his shoulder in a gesture of support that spoke of a marriage built on mutual understanding. Mrs. Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she began. "The night you left, after that terrible fight with your grandfather, I couldn't bear to let you go believing that we didn't support your dreams, so I followed you to the bus station." Walter's face went pale. "Grace, you never told me." "Because I was ashamed," she said, looking at her husband with eyes full of regret, "ashamed that I was too much of a coward to do what needed to be done." Thomas leaned forward, his face a mixture of confusion and growing understanding. "You were at the bus station. I heard you on the phone," Mrs. Grace continued, her voice breaking. "I heard you crying, heard you telling someone that you thought your grandfather was right, that maybe you were being selfish for wanting to leave. I heard you say that maybe love meant staying, even when staying felt like dying inside." The impact of these words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Jake watched as his face crumpled with the weight of 15 years of misunderstood guilt. "You heard that? Every word," Mrs. Grace whispered. "And I sat in that pickup truck like a coward and watched the bus take you away, knowing that you left believing your choice had hurt us. But Thomas, my beautiful boy, your choice didn't hurt us. It made us proud. Every building you've designed, every success you've achieved, every moment of happiness you've found, we've celebrated it all from afar." Walter stood up abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch. "Grace, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you go to him?" "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if I interfered, I'd make things worse. Afraid that my voice wouldn't be strong enough to overcome the doubt that fight had planted in his heart." Jake stepped forward then, extending the envelope to Thomas. "Your grandmother wrote this letter the day after you left. She's been carrying it for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to give it to you." Thomas took the envelope with shaking hands, looking at his grandmother's careful handwriting. "To my brave grandson." As he opened it and began to read, Jake watched emotions play across his face like weather patterns across the desert sky. The letter was everything Mrs. Grace's heart had wanted to say 15 years ago. Words of pride, of encouragement, of unconditional love. It spoke of a grandmother who understood that true love sometimes meant letting go, even when holding on felt safer. It told Thomas that his dreams weren't selfish but sacred, that his courage to leave had inspired her even as it broke her heart. "You called me brave," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked up from the letter. "But, Grandma Grace, you were the brave one. You raised me to believe I could do anything, be anything. The only reason I had the courage to leave was because you taught me that love doesn't mean limiting someone. It means believing in their limitless potential." Walter returned to his chair, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Son, I owe you an apology. The biggest apology of my life. I was wrong to try to keep you here, wrong to make you choose between love and dreams. A man my age should have known better." Thomas stood and embraced his grandfather. And Jake could see 15 years of pain and misunderstanding dissolving in that single gesture. "Grandpa Walter, you gave me the foundation to build on. Every skill you taught me, every lesson about integrity and hard work, I used all of it. I just used it in a bigger world than you'd imagined." Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her husband finally find peace with his past. The twins stirred sleepily, and she gathered them close, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the healing of wounds that had seemed permanent. Mrs. Grace stood slowly, moving to the porch railing where she could look out over the ranch that had been her home for 60 years. "You know what I realized tonight, watching you with your boys," she said, her voice carrying a new strength. "I realized that love isn't about keeping people close. It's about helping them become who they're meant to be. Wherever that journey takes them." Thomas joined her at the railing, slipping his arm around her fragile shoulders. "And I realized that you can leave a place without abandoning it. Every building I design has a little bit of this ranch in it, a little bit of the lessons you and Grandpa Walter taught me." Jake felt a profound sense of completion as he watched the Matthews family finally find their way back to each other. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the vast New Mexico sky. It was the kind of moment that made you believe in the possibility of redemption, in the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. "Jake," Walter said, turning to face the man who had made this reunion possible, "I don't know how we can ever repay you for this gift you've given us." Jake smiled, thinking of the medallion of San Judas that still hung from his rearview mirror, of the letter he'd written to his own estranged father that morning, inspired by the courage he'd witnessed in this family. "Walter, sometimes the universe puts people in your path not because they need to be repaid, but because they need to learn something important. This journey has taught me that it's never too late to choose love over pride, truth over comfortable silence." As the evening deepened and the family continued their reunion under the star-filled sky, Jake prepared to continue his journey. But he knew he would carry this experience with him forever. The reminder that healing was always possible, that families could be mended, that sometimes the most important deliveries weren't cargo at all, but hope. Thomas walked him to his truck, carrying the spirit of a man who had finally found peace with his past and excitement for his future. "Jake, you'll always be family to us. This ranch will always be a place where you're welcome." Jake climbed into his cab, looking back at the porch where 4 generations of Matthews' family were gathered in the warm glow of the house lights. Mrs. Grace waved from her rocking chair, her face radiant with a happiness that made her look decades younger. Walter was teaching his great-grandsons to identify constellations, while Rebecca and Thomas planned their extended stay to help with ranch improvements. As Jake drove back onto Route 60, the medallion of San Judas swaying gently from his mirror, he felt the profound satisfaction of having been part of something miraculous. The road stretched ahead of him, the same endless ribbon of asphalt he'd traveled for 15 years. But he was no longer the same man who had started this journey. In his pocket was a letter addressed to Dad, the first communication he'd attempted with his own father in 3 years. Inspired by the Matthews family's courage to bridge the gap between love and pride, Jake had finally found the words to say what needed to be said. The desert night enveloped his truck in its vast embrace, and Jake smiled as he thought about Mrs. Grace's words, "The light is different today." She had been right. Sometimes a single moment of courage, a single act of love, could change the quality of light in your entire world. Behind him, the ranch house grew smaller in his mirrors, but the warmth of what had happened there would travel with him forever. Ahead of him lay new roads, new deliveries, new opportunities to be the person the universe placed in someone's path when they needed it most. As he settled in for the long drive ahead, Jake Martinez knew that he had experienced something rare and precious, the chance to deliver hope, to transport healing, to carry love across the distances that pride and misunderstanding had created. And in doing so, he had discovered that sometimes the most important cargo a man could carry was the simple willingness to help others find their way home. End of history. Dear viewers, we hope that Jake's journey and the Matthews family's reunion has touched your hearts as deeply as it has ours. Like the desert roads that brought these souls together, our channel is a pathway where stories of love, redemption, and second chances converge. If this tale of family healing has moved you, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories of human connection. In the comments below, tell us about your own experiences with family reconciliation or moments when a stranger became an unexpected blessing in your life. Don't miss our upcoming stories that explore the beautiful complexity of relationships and the miracles that happen when we choose love over pride. Until next time, may your own roads lead you home to the people who matter most.